So.
Well, I like to say that I was one of those lucky guys who was in the right place in the right time, discovered this phenomenon known as Brazilian Jiu Jitsu before the UFC, and began my adventure in it back in Horion's garage when it was Horion, Hoyce, Hickson, and Hegan. And I caught this bug very early on and have been hooked on it ever since. There's a line I used to say about 10 years back that said, but jiu-jitsu destroyed my career and ruined my relationships with normal people. But yeah, so I mean, it's kind of one of those weird things when one has told their origin story so many times. What I really am is an amateur anthropologist who wishes I was more of a zoologist. And that zoologist wishes I was an astrophysicist. And what that is the layers of my mind, the layers of my interests. And I am blessed with curiosity. And I fear ignorance within myself and others. And as a result, it has enabled me to continually pursue the arts and the sciences with a love of philosophy and history whilst doing so. And that's kind of my MO, my ideal MO. And like everyone, we have our ideals, and then we have the reality and the navigation through everyday life as a biological primate who has language and guns.
You know, I've listened to several podcasts. I've seen you on documentaries, and it's one of those things. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that you've told this whole how you started training jiu-jitsu many times, right? And so, you know, something a little more around that topic I wanted to ask you about was, you know, when you were first introduced to this art, I feel like you were introduced to it, and I've heard you speak on this as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, right?
Yes.
But, you know, and that was like you mentioned pre-UFC. So when I was first introduced to it, 2006, it was introduced to me and referred to as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yes.
So, you know, and now with a couple of books that have come out, we've got the Drysdale books, Shoke,
Yep.
you know, and this is just like literally what I happen to have on my desktop. But, you know, I've been tearing into these. I'm a historian, taught college for 5 years.
Right on. Yeah.
And it is interesting because, you know, what is it in your mind that why is there that delineation, and what are we actually doing? Is it Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Kodokan Judo? How do we understand this?
You know, for a while, and again, you know, this was around 20 years back when, like, so in the 1990s, the 90s were this fascinating age on the entire planet, right? Communism had fallen, the rise of the internet, the globalization seemed all good and not bad, unless, of course, you had a job making washing machines or car parts in the Midwest. Ultimately, globalization in the 90s was this kind of wonderful thing. And as a result of this, the information age was hitting its midlife and its stride and rapidly rushing to where we suddenly had an abundance of information at our fingertips. And cultures were intermingling. And in the 90s, in the 80s, what you had was Japanese jiu-jitsu modified in Brazil, chiefly by the Gracie family and their tribe and students, branded very effectively as Gracie the Jiu-Jitsu. Like I used to always raise the question, why isn't it called Maeda Jiu-Jitsu? And why does somebody with, say, my last name continue to call it Gracie? Why don't I call it Haueter Jiu-Jitsu? That's my expression. So by 1999-ish, what you had was this art of Japanese origin, Brazilian modified, and American influenced. And the American, and I will say Russian, influence on the art is very noticeable. You can even, like, the reason why the Americana armbar is called the Americana was because Bob Anderson, who trained Holes in Greco, had gone down and they named that armbar after them because there was a time of new discovery and new growth. And most of that was occurring in Brazil. And it was being influenced by this globalizing culture. So what we have now is what I call, we are deep in the age of speciation, because the jiu-jitsu that I was learning in 1993 was definitely Brazilian Gracie style oriented for Vale Tudo. It was basically almost engineered to be able to fight against other martial art styles and other combat sports. It was the small man's answer to the big, powerful wrestler. It was the intelligent man's answer to the guy who could punch and kick super fast. And then as the sport evolved out of it, as it became jiu-jitsu against the jiu-jitsu, steel hardened steel, and there was a speciation that occurred. And where that kind of went was what I call, which is my way of keeping all this balanced, is you think street, you train the sport, and you practice the art in a bar. I don't mean Chuck's backyard Valley Tudo the matches. That's just unlicensed sport. What I mean is, if I take this guy and that guy and I throw you in a pit and one guy walks out alive, no rules, groin strikes, eye gouges, you are fighting for life and limb. That's what I mean when I say you think street. You train the sport. And the combat sports are these wonderful delivery tools based upon man-made rules to create, in essence, a scientific experiment that says, here are the parameters in which we will allow. And from my scientific vantage point, I want to see what evolves when you remove all strikes. And what you get is stuff that you would never have discovered, that would have never been developed if you always had strikes involved. If you always had a groin strike, you would have never had the guard evolve in the way it evolved. That evolved based on the sport of Vale Tudo, which is in essence a duel. It's patriarchal culture which likes to duel. And this comes out of a dueling culture. And by understanding that, you understand the jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So history background, in Arkansas, we have a massive history associated with dueling. One of our founding fathers of the state, he was killed in a duel.
That's right.
So some of the Arkansas stereotype you see is rooted in many things, but one of the things that rolls into that stereotype is we've had a long history of dueling all the way up until and a little after the Civil War,
Yes.
But it's something that comes up in every period of the history you talk about once civilization arrived. That's
yes.
What we see.
Yep. And you know, earlier I was involved in 3 lengthy text discussions, the debates. One of them with one of my good friends who is leaning towards pro-Palestine. One of them with my good friend who's leaning towards pro-Israel. One of them with a friend who is full all in with Israel. And it's one of those issues, and I'm stepping into a shitstorm now, knowing it, that like everything, it depends on the vantage point of which you are in. Like, what I try to do is not see where humans are right or wrong, but see why humans do what they do and what causes our behavior, which is why I say again, I'm an amateur anthropologist. And I look at history through the lens of a biologist, in that I am fascinated with the sociological traits and the psychology that pushes them, that humans engage in. And we are violent, nasty creatures. And at the same time, we are wonderful, compassionate, and loving creatures. And if I was raised in the open air prison of the Gaza Strip, I'm sure I would react the same way the Palestinian does. And if I was a Jewish settler and I know the history of the Holocaust and the pogroms and everything, I would want a homeland, a place where I feel safe. And the middle of this is this steep hill. And I try to hover intellectually in the middle, because emotionally it's going to pull me to a side. And once I start pulling on a side, that hill's so steep you fall in, which makes you anti the other side. And 2 things can simultaneously be true at once.
Is that what you refer to as the dialectic?
That's the Hegelian dialectic.
Well, so I have a background of 27 hours philosophy, took logic.
Awesome.
But you know, in thinking back, looking back at that private we had with Hickson last, and talking with Burns and Jack and some of the black belts in that room, I believe it was when he showed this Kimura escape that, you know, there was well, it doesn't work if they do this, but then you could just do that. And our minds were blown that your mind was blown, but you were like, oh, that's the dialectic. And I've also heard you talk with this, and I believe that we might have had this conversation a little bit last time I saw you, was you're kind of talking about that concept of breaking out of the binary. Is that also, I mean, so like that is something I've like really been thinking a lot about, is that the third way, right?
Yes.
And coexistence of things that, I mean, that's what dialectic reasoning is.
As Hickson often says, it's you, what I call, you're hovering in the middle. You're hovering in that zone of balance. And it seems like when you go to the extremes of either answer, you lose truth, and you definitely lose the middle. But at the same time, you have to explore the extremes to find the middle. That's what enables you to find it, because we are biological binary thinking machines. And the trap is seeing things as black or white. Whereas really what there is a bunch of spectrums, and some are more darker gray and some are more lighter gray. I hope you heard that.
I did. Yeah, we're good.
Good. Yeah. So, yeah, that's my like, you know, as much as I love philosophy, mathematics, physics, I am really bad at memorization. Kind of like, I can't remember whether it was Foucault or Derrida who said this, or it just, to me, it's unimportant who said or who found out what. It's what's important is the ideas and the concepts. And where I like the postmodernists is in the fact that they question objective truth. And where I like the modernist is where the modernist searches for objective truth. And both of these things can be simultaneously wonderful tools to get yourself closer to an ever moving truth, because our brains want to trap things in time. And time is our mystery, because our thinking patterns, the binary thinking machine, is in essence trapped in linear time. And I don't word it well, but through early LSD experiences, I've seen it, I felt it, I've experienced what a universe would be like to escape the binary. And I've forever chased that.
That's interesting. I've heard, I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Alex Gray, but he, just in looking at his artwork, he's the guy that does all the artwork for the band Tool,
Okay. Yep.
for the most part, and he has these, I guess they're technically, he calls them like churches, but it's just a place like with all of his art. But he talks about different experiences in his life where he kind of broke out, like what you're saying, and that was the art that he was able to produce with it.
I mean, like, as you know, the philosophy of art is a fascinating thing, along with the history of art. And you cannot understand the history of art without understanding the philosophy of art, and vice versa. It's impossible. So, and artists are like, art is absolutely useless in terms of a utilitarian value until you start understanding the utility of well-being. Then suddenly it's valuable. And as you know, somebody who's cracked into history, the more you find, the more you realize you don't know. And there's no such thing as understanding all of anything. So it's this constant unfolding that either will bring you fear or thrill, exhilaration. And I lean towards exhilaration. I want to live not because I'm afraid of death, because I'm afraid of no longer experiencing this magic thing we have of experiencing. I like experiencing.
No, that's an interesting way to look at death. That's I never really thought about that way, honestly. But I mean, that's because there's almost like a stigma about people overcome your fear to die. That's
Yes.
Marcus Aurelius is. I mean, you see, that's an iconic thing, but it's like, what do you? It's really like, man, this is the experiencing things, and Pierce says this is great. And if you like that, and I've also heard a lot of older people near the end of their life, they're just like, I'm kind of tired of this experience. I've heard several people say that.
And when I was younger, that would horrify me. It would scare me. It's like, am I going to be at that place where I no longer find thrill in new music and new art and new things? If I start only holding nostalgia as my value, then I start thinking everything new is bad and wrong. And before I know it, the fascist starts to sound really good. And I can understand culturally why it happens. And there's a great line that I don't know who it's attributed to, and it's probably been ripped off 1,000 times, and I'm going to steal it. But politics runs downstream of culture. And culture runs downstream from economics. So the world right now is experiencing what? Inflation, massive amounts. America doesn't even have it as bad as Europe. And what that does is alter culture, which alters political ideologies. And again, I'm a centrist. So what scares me, but I also find it fascinating, are when the extremes start gaining influence and Overton windows begin but to make shifts. And it's like I pretend that I am a humanoid alien from another world, or a human from the future who's going back in time and observing this period of history. I want to get first, before I do any microcosm view, I want to get the biggest view of history I possibly can, which is, somewhere around 13.8 billion years ago is where I want to start. And I want to end with the death of the universe. And then somewhere I'm going to walk it back and realize somewhere, I think it's around 4 billion years, our Earth will be swallowed by the sun. Sometime around 3.5 billion years ago, life formed on the planet. And I'm going to bring us down to little old me with this tiny little meat computer who's having this experience called life on a speck of dust in a giant galaxy that is a speck of dust among galaxies. That's where I want to start my view from. So, and having said all that lofty stuff, I cannot escape my ego and my emotions that are clinging to things. And that's where the wonders of Eastern philosophy enter. And I like to say my philosophy triangle is that of the Stoics, the Taoists / the Buddhists, and the Western modernist / postmodernist. And the blending of those is where I get my balance. But jiu-jitsu is like music. And very rarely does somebody create an original song or an original sound. It's very rare. And when they do, it's wonderful and it's new. And then when we look back on it historically, we see what it really is pieces and parts of another music and other songs. So everything is borrowing and or stolen from something else. And there are jiu-jitsu guys who are like cover bands, and they're great cover bands. They do no original songs, but they do cover bands even better than the original band. They're tighter. The band works better. Everything's flowing more. But jiu-jitsu is jazz. It's an irreplicable. You cannot replicate the very same match or even the very same section of a roll. You're riffing off of things. You're working in a way that your opponent, you two are in this dance of life and the dance of death. And that's, for me, the addicting part of this. I like mashups. I love mashups. I feel like I'm a mashup artist who occasionally gets something a little bit new that's uniquely me out of that.
Look, regarding some of that, let's say you extrapolate out the amount of time that you have been involved with martial arts in your life. And you could extrapolate your time travel analogy, and you could travel to that many years in the future, right? Like, I imagine
yes,
that you have seen. So I've seen so much change since the Ultimate Fighter era when I got involved in training. I could only imagine you starting before the UFC, training after the UFC, all the way through that era I got involved in to now. Like, if you could just take that number of years you've been involved and fast forward that many years, like what would, in terms of this continued specialization and specialization and stylization of sports, let's say you just come back to look at martial arts. Specifically, you're interested in jiu-jitsu, obviously.
Yes.
What do you see? I mean, what does that look like in your head?
Well, before I even go into that, and guide me back if I end up off track. Okay. So let's use the analogy of the evolution of a cat. Somewhere millions of years ago, there's the ancestral cat that gave rise to the cheetah, the lion, the tiger, and the panther, and the house cat. And that cheetah has evolved and adapted to the environment to hunt in the plains of Africa, to have a really good sprint and a few good jukes and jags, and it catches its prey and it eats. The panther has evolved to adapt to hunt in the jungle, in thick foliage, maneuvering around branches and all this stuff. If you take the cheetah and you put him in the jungle, it starves. If you take the panther and put him in the savannah, it cannot run fast enough to eat. So martial arts works in this way, that it evolves to adapt the environment in which it sits in. And an environment is stronger than will. And the post-World War II invention of neoprene foam, soft mats, made the ground part of grappling suddenly more doable, more pleasurable, and less painful to your elbows and knees. Whereas most grappling pre-war was done much more about the clinch and the throw, not as much what happens on the ground, because it fucking hurts to roll around on the ground until you have a soft mat. And that opened the doors up to rediscovering what probably the Greeks knew from Greek wrestling, what the ancient Japanese did on straw mats, and with the Brazilian culture, which is a much more flowing, move your hips culture, it altered the art. So you have a speciation of a cats. So one could say, as an analogy, the Japanese Jiu Jitsu judo is the lion. The Brazilian is the tiger. They can still breed, but that offspring is sterile. It doesn't do well in a Jiu Jitsu competition and doesn't do well in a judo competition. That's where speciation occurs. And if we take this far enough, eventually you're going to speciate into a different animal. And I apologize to those of you creationists out there who don't believe in the fact of evolution, but it's just the fact, is that the vast amounts of time, things change. And humans do selective breeding within our cultures and our species. The modern piece of corn, banana, strawberry, apple is a result of selective breeding. And this jiu-jitsu in which we do is selected for by the environment in which it exists in. An environment is stronger than will. You cannot think yourself into better jiu-jitsu. You can only train yourself. When the mind won't go, you bring the body. You go through the motions, and then your mind catches up. And if you have a resistant, stubborn mind like mine, that is how I have to pursue this. Because the key to all knowledge is humility. The key to all learning is being in a place where you say, I don't know shit. And I watch my coaches, the Machados, I watched Hickson question things and continue to learn. Because jiu-jitsu is the art of adaptation. How do I adapt to chaotic hand-to-hand combat in the most efficient, least athletic way? That is the art of jiu-jitsu. The sport is, how do I deploy my art within the man-made rules of the game, utilizing all my athletics? That's where those two begin to create a new yin and yang dialectic. And when one practices the art You get to risk, you get to experiment, you get to try new shit that you're not going to try in a street fight or a sport match. That enables growth. That's the beauty of it. That is the liberal of this thing. The conservative is the street part of it. This keep it honest. Let's not get all woo wee wee out here. And let's always remember the original primal purpose that we began this thing. Now, you could say that's completely unimportant. I don't care. I'm not going to ever fight in the street. I don't want to. And eventually what you get are the fantasy arts, the silat, aikido, and these other things, which even those have some philosophical truth. And they're wonderful and they're good to watch.
Martial arts role in entertainment. If you research the early history of jiu-jitsu with the circuses and vaudeville culture, the Hollywood, for all throughout, from Bruce Lee to American Ninja, kickboxer, all of that. But I mean, what sort of, and now we have the UFC has merged with WWE and USADA's out, so it's and that's all for entertainment purposes, right?
Yeah.
So like what larger role within this same conversation does entertainment play? I mean, it's always been a part of the conversation, even if it was the emperor's court in ancient Japan. That's what they would bring the martial artist in.
Yes.
Have a performance.
Yes. We humans are entertainment addicts. We will entertain ourselves and we seek to be entertained. We seek to be distracted and pleasured through entertainment. It's something we always do. And the promoter of the UFC has different goals than the artist. The promoter is trying to put butts in seats to get money and engineering the rules to make eyeballs want to watch it, because real wrestling is boring. That's why real wrestlers created fake wrestling for entertainment, because nobody wants to sit there and watch a boring grappling match in their minds. We like it because we're grapplers. But the common man, like, I would rather watch an NFL game than play it. And I would rather do grappling than watch it. It's just not a fun thing to watch, in my opinion. And the promoter's trying to do things to make it entertaining. And the sideshow is always the drama that creates a story and a narrative where we get to see this young fighter struggle through life to where he rose and came up. We get to see the shit talking at the weigh-ins and all this stuff. I mean, that is part of the show. No judgment on it, no shade. It is what it is, right? It's part of the show. As a snobby cultural anthropologist, I find it fascinating watching the human interaction and how serious these people take this thing. In the age of AI, on the brink of thermonuclear war, climate change, nothing could be less important than whether your arm lock is good or not. So I'm not going to get all wrapped up in judging myself or somebody else who thinks this thing is the most important thing in the world. But what I'm going to do is, while I'm on the mat, I'm going to pretend it is. I'm going to pretend like I'm an actor, that I want to look good, feel good, and I don't want a clumsy, klutzy armbar. I want a beautiful, perfect armbar, right? I'm looking for an ideal. And then I want to pretend the eyeballs are off of me. And would I still want to be here? And the answer is yes. And what humans fear more than death is to be publicly shamed, to be embarrassed. And that is why people don't compete. People that love jiu-jitsu don't compete because it's embarrassing to lose. You have a bunch of eyeballs watching you. Where it's different when you're rolling at your school in the club because you don't have an audience. And it's the best fighters and combat athletes are the ones who either lean in and say, I'm going to entertain like a gladiator. Are you entertained? Or the ones who pretend the audience doesn't exist and I'm just here because I love this combat sport. And it's usually a spectrum and blends of these all in between. And there are some matches, some fights where you're in the zone and others where you're just fucking not. There are some nights rolling in my garage where I feel like I'm rolling good in the zone, and other nights where I feel like I can't micro adjust, I can't micro frame, I can't micro the time. Sure, I can still beat the purple belt, but it doesn't feel like I'm doing the art of Jiu Jitsu. I feel like I'm combat wrestling and struggling with my age, trying to put a bunch of athletics behind my knowledge.
Yeah, no, that is jiu-jitsu is one of the most humbling things ever. And I've always kind of tried to approach things like, if I'm scared to do it, I'm gonna do it. But that was jumping off the high dive when I was a kid.
Yep.
It was competing when I was coming up through the color belts, competed a countless number of times. And then I was just like, okay, well, I did it. I was kind of scared of it, whatever. I did it a bunch of times. I had success along the way, and it was a growing experience. I can, give back to my students in that way. But at the end of the day, it wasn't my favorite thing on earth to be doing. It's kind of like what you're saying. I remember my first tournament ever saying, like, why can't I roll like that in the gym? I was rolling this way, and then over here is this other thing. I mean, and it's, you don't really, I guess you scratch the surface on like why that is. I've heard countless students of mine say that have competed. It's like, it's not the same as when I roll in the gym, and the audience is definitely an interesting point.
Yes. And your opponent rolls in a different way in competition than in the club roll. And when you're rolling at your club, you can feel when you're with an opponent who's coming at you like it's a real jiu-jitsu match. That's a different energy. And that energy is actually closer to the street than is the art flow energy. So it's good for us to experience that kind of energy. And in the olden days, that was the energy in which we trained for. Because that was back when it was jiu-jitsu versus other styles. And there was the phase in which people hit the panic button, have an adrenaline jolt, and do all kinds of wild shit. And to be able to control them was an aspect of the art. And then again, we went to jiu-jitsu against the jiu-jitsu, which gave different growth patterns.
So here's real quick, just like a parallel, I've been doing tons of research, looking into some of the earlier history, but particularly just, trying to answer some of these questions we're talking about today, there's been more research made available, primary sources. I wrote my master's thesis on the history of martial arts, but it's always been an interest of mine. And one parallel that I've drawn is this, and part of it, and I just want to get your words on it, because I mean, I feel like we're in a way a victim of this in our own time. To me, these members of the notorious group, the Dirty Dozen, and to people in the jiu-jitsu community that might have got involved when I did, they, for whatever reason, due to no fault of your own, we have placed significance on these people. And people I've talked to, maybe they don't even realize their own significance in their own time. But there's some parallels with, the first wave of Japanese immigrants that came to Brazil and the first people that they taught, right?
Yes.
The Mario Aleixos, the Carlos Gracies, the Jacinto Ferros, Donato Pires dos Reis, the Brazilians. There is a definite parallel in that story with the group of your generation
Yes,
that got involved.
and it's interesting because the politics of these organizations, the CBJJF, IBJJF, whatever association, like I've been noticing in the last couple of years, guys who weren't the first 12 getting their corral belts. And that's the politics of this, right? And occasionally people will come up and ask me, dude, aren't you pissed off they gave that guy a corral belt? He was a purple belt when you were a black belt, whatever. And honestly, no, I'm not fucking mad. I honestly don't care. The belt is a symbol of personal progress. It's a symbol to be able to categorize yourself in competitions. It is something that we place so much weight and importance on that shouldn't be there, in my opinion. Now, am I going to respect and honor my rank? Yes. Do I want my rank honestly given? Absolutely. And that is where almost everybody goes through an experience at least one of the belts where they feel kind of like a fraud. Like, shit, I'm not really this belt. And me personally, if I was one of those guys who was awarded a corral belt, I would kind of feel like a fraud because history is recorded and we know you weren't. We know somehow you, as Hickson says, you jumped the line. When like Horian tried to promote Hickson a red belt, he put him on the spot because Hickson has two shitty choices: be an asshole and reject it, or jump the line and take it. And one could argue he's Hickson Gracie. Of course he's the fucking red belt. He's the grand master and all that. And one of the most humble things Hickson did was recant and say, no, I'm not there. I'm not going to jump the line ahead of anyone else.
Man, that was an emotionally charged moment. So at that event, for whatever reason, out of all of the moments in time, Hickson was like, oh, hey, you guy that Jack introduced to me at the beginning, come out here. We're going to do this guard retention. And then I look up and see Jean-Jacques, Fabio Santos, Pedro Sa, and I'm just like, oh, man, what is going on? But man, and then, I remember he personally got emotional about that. And you could tell that there was some flattery there, but then there was also like, okay, I got to reason with myself on this.
Integrity. You see, like there's leadership traits. And one of them is integrity. You have to have integrity for whatever system or institution you are in. And the breaking of that creates chaos downrank. And whether you're lean conservative or liberal, I look at people's character, at integrity. That's the most important thing. Then fairness and open-mindedness, because I lean liberal, meaning the opposite is illiberal. Conservative, the opposite is progressive. And sometimes we interplay these words and they become the same thing. And when I say left and right, I almost always mean economic, not social things, right? But they also interplay and wax and wane off of each other. That's the flow of history. And it's like when you look at words and ideologies, the liberal in Australia is equivalent to the libertarian free market capitalist in America. But yes, and so what I want to be is a scientific historian, which is the ideals of journalism. But journalism is the first draft of history. And those who have an agenda, for whatever reason, will try to slander their supposed enemies to create that first draft to give a different impression of history. And history, they say, history is written by the winners. That's partially true. History is written by the writers who write history. And usually that is the winner, usually. So I always think it's important to strive and find the loser's history. Whoever lost, whatever historical battle this is, let's find out what their side of this is.
No, that's a huge point. In the South, we fell victim to that after the Civil War.
Yes.
There's in academia, there's a phrase, it's the myth of the lost cause.
Yes, lost cause, I know.
And that was a case where, in the South, those writers, they lived there and they had sympathies. But in the case, Drysdale uses this in his newest book, but like basically discussing some of the rivalries within the Gracie family is a civil war, right?
Civil war, yes.
Because it very much led to there being sort of there's the Helio narrative and the Carlos narrative, and
yes.
Which one would you like the most? It is binary again.
Yeah, and there were two other Gracie brothers, or was it three, who have often been written out of history.
Three: George Osvaldo,
and
Gastow Gracie Philo.
Yes, and there was a bunch of other non-Gracie last name but guys who almost Stalinistically have been photoshopped out of the history of jiu-jitsu.
Well, Haueter's that Mauricio Gomez is Haueter's dad, which I know his mom's Hala, but that's an example. I've seen that. I heard you say that Hegan was introduced to you as Hegan Gracie. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that is part of the honor culture that is involved in this, where the male heir to the throne is part of the hierarchy. And it's very hard for the modern American or European to understand this culture, because in some ways we are so opposite of that. Like, I remember, and this is a long little tale, I remember when I was a purple belt at Nelson Montero's school, and I'm rolling, and these obviously wealthy Arabs came in, and we were rolling with their guards, with obviously bodyguards, mopping them up, giving them that experience of, oh my God, I'm helpless on the mat. And one of those guys was the prince. And that prince was suddenly enlightened to the power of the jiu-jitsu. And that's what started the whole Abu Dhabi thing. And Nelson Montero came in like 2 weeks after, the big smile on his face, and says, guys, next week I'm going to Abu Dhabi. You guys handle the school. I mean, because they offered him $1 million for a year to go teach. And it's kind of one of those things. You used to joke all the time, I missed my prince by 2 belts. And then I would have done the $1 million. But it's kind of one of those things where I also realized that in terms of the honor culture, the Brazilian culture and the subculture of Brazilian martial arts definitely dovetailed with the Saudi royal culture, because that's
interesting.
They're both honor cultures, and the Western American European culture kind of clashes now with that, even though 100 years ago we too were an honor culture dueling society. And there are some that want to bring that back My personal opinion is that's a very bad idea. As a philosopher historian, I want to explore it, however, and understand it. And if utilitarianism is one of our goals, then I could see why honor culture, dueling, is definitely not good. It's kind of like Winston Churchill, and I don't remember whether it was him who said this or someone around. It was like shortly after the war, whatever. The world would be a wonderful place if the English controlled the politics, because they have the manners and the propriety and all that. The Germans, the engineering, the Italians, the food, the French, the poetry and music or art, right? It's like every culture has something they do very well. And but British really do politics well. And America, as much as we want to say we're these independent things, we're a European colony. We are a British influenced European colony that rose out of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. And before the Age of Reason, what was it? The Dark Ages, where magical thinking and religion ruled humans for thousands of years. And then some people said, and it took hundreds of years and is still in progress, is let's look for natural answers instead of supernatural answers. And then rose the Age of Reason, science, history approached from a view as I want to know what's true, not what helps my side, my argument win. And science, via Karl Popper and others, was instead of trying to choose an opinion and find evidence to support it, let's try to prove my own theory, my own opinion wrong. Let's falsify my view. And thus was born modern scientific method. So if I'm going to approach the jiu-jitsu, I could find out a lot of stuff by trial and error, but I'm not going to live long enough to do everything by trial and error. I have to learn from the guidance of others, and I have to explore it and attempt to falsify my knowledge. Let's see where my armbar doesn't work, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, well, and two, I've thought about this multiple times. A historian friend of mine who actually was my first jiu-jitsu student ever is now a black belt, but sadly moved to Washington, D.C. But he was the first person that told me about this, and I've thought about it like 10 times since we've been talking. But it seems as that you view the world through the lens of like chaos theory. You're using all of these other modes of thinking, which if you think about it, like our educational system, we're exposed to all these math over here. But, that's what we can use those. Is I use the metaphor like you with biology of lenses on a microscope.
Yes.
You do that with the metaphor works with the rule sets. But it's really just using the scientific method in ways to think critically about information and in ways to learn and process the information. And it's interesting the day and age we live in and the capabilities that we, like you said, with AI, that we can do that on the level that we can, and just how much that's changed in the information age. In addition to all these other things that we've talked about, right?
Yes.
But let's wrap up with this. So, I kind of hit on this earlier, but being in that private lesson with Rickson and seeing you get your mind blown, like what a cool thing to see. I've told several people about that. That was an impactful experience for me, just to see that, like, okay, well, this is the highest ranked guy in the room. This is one of the higher ranked guys I've had the opportunity to train with, and has seen and done a lot of things, and is still just eyes full of wonder little kid here, like myself, with Rickson Gracie. But I've constantly heard Rickson referred to as the master's master, right? He just recently promoted Henzo in Abu Dhabi. We're talking about that Abu Dhabi a second ago and that connection. But I mean, I feel like you're just one of the guys like Chris or Nori or any of these people that we mutually know that I would just say you get it. But what is it you get? What is it about his jiu-jitsu? You trained with him since the beginning. I've heard you talk about the first private being the headlock defense, and then that was the question you asked that day. But there's something special that's kept you engaged with wanting to learn from him and
Well,
many people. What is that?
let's use the art analogy. We can all draw a happy face, right? I can draw a circle, two dots, and a mouth, and I made a happy face. But not everybody can be Rembrandt, and Hickson is Rembrandt. So there's always some little nuance that I could rediscover or freshly learn, more so from Hickson than most other grapplers who I experienced. But like last night, one of my newer black belts showed me this really cool way to just push your arm to escape out of a head and arm. And like, it was like, wow, that's magic. And I because I wasn't moving my hip in the way, I couldn't make it work. So maybe I learned it years ago. I dismissed it. But then, like, he showed me just with this little movement how to do it. And I was blown away.
Yeah, no, that's well, like the headlock thing. I took two or three, the smallest, the frame, the moving the elbow out, and yeah, it's crazy. You just got to go to that guy or a guy like yourself or a Jack Toffer that has had that experience and to learn those things. It's like an exclusive form of jiu-jitsu. So this is way I understand it.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay, last thing. I know that you have Scott Burr's coming on. I'm going to do an interview with him next week. I know you guys are working on a book. I know things are coming together with that. We spoke about it a little bit when I was in California, but is there anything that you're facing with that is like an unforeseen challenge in documenting your life? I mean, you got incredible stories, but I mean, how is documenting that not like what you thought it would be?
You kind of came in and out, and I missed a
Okay, book with Scott Burr. Has there been any
Yeah.
challenges in writing that book and documenting your story and kind of, getting this stuff written down?
Yes, it's been a huge challenge. Part of it is what I really am, again, is a mashup artist. I'm an essayist, not a long arc story narrative. That's just not how my life works. I don't work on a timeline. Like, it started today and then the middle of the week happened and now we're at the end. I jump all over the place. So I'm kind of a pain in the ass when it comes to assisting me in writing a book. And a lot of writing from that style is really in the art of editing. And it's like, let's look at the art of a film. There are things that can only be shown in the art of film. You can't even show it in a still image. Just like I cannot with words describe to you what the oil painting looks like. And I cannot paint you a picture of what a song is. And jiu-jitsu is this communication art that is done through touch, sensing, and feel. And the internet video has done this thing where you get the illusion that you're getting the whole picture. And you can't get that without the touch, the feel, or what Hickson calls connection. And Hickson's not the only guy who does this, but he definitely is the icon of what represents continual growth and adapting jiu-jitsu to his aging body. And that's the part that I like. I learned what Hickson and I would call the essence. It's not the steps of the move that really interests me. It's the feel. Because the steps are available online. You could learn all the steps. But you cannot learn the feel. That has to be experienced. If that makes sense.
No, agreed. Well, I am looking forward to this book when it comes out. I'm looking forward to talking with Scott more about it here next week. And, we'll just read it when it comes out. When with all the good jiu-jitsu books coming out, Worth Defending with Richard Bressler and Scott Burr, it's just a great time. I've always wanted there to be books like these, and here we are.
Yeah, it's a strange time indeed.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Professor, and I'm sure I'll be seeing you here pretty soon. I think that I'm gonna be headed back out there here in early February, so maybe we can get
come to my garage and have a private.
I would love to, sir. Thank you.
All right, brother.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
Out.